The afternoon sun slanted through the mullioned windows of the Rosemary Inn, casting dancing patterns across the worn Persian carpet of the residence lounge. Miss Jane Marple sat in her preferred corner chair, the one that afforded an excellent view of both the entrance hall and the garden terrace, her knitting needles clicking with the gentle rhythm of long practice. She had been taking the waters at nearby Harrogate for her rheumatism, though privately she suspected her nephew Raymond's prescription had more to do with his concern about her living alone in St. Mary Mead than any medical necessity. The inn itself possessed that peculiarly English quality of being simultaneously grand and shabby, like an elderly duchess whose jewels had been sold but whose bearing remained impeccable. Its guests were largely what one might expect, genteel people of modest means, seeking the respectability of a proper establishment without the expense of a fashionable hotel. Miss Marple had already catalogued them with the thoroughness of a botanist studying specimens. There was Colonel Weatherby, whose military bearing could not quite disguise the tremor in his hands when he thought himself unobserved. Mrs. Fortescue, a widow of indeterminate age who wore her grief like a well-tailored coat, fashionable, but perhaps not entirely genuine. The Reverend Mr. Dane and his colourless wife, who seemed to apologize for their very existence, and young Mr. Hartwell, whose profession remained mysteriously undefined despite a week of careful village inquiry. It was therefore with considerable interest that Miss Marple observed the arrival of a new guest that Thursday afternoon. The gentleman who entered the lounge was perhaps 55, well dressed in a way that suggested London tailors rather than provincial establishments. He carried himself with the particular kind of careful composure that, in Miss Marple's experience, often indicated a man with something to hide. His eyes swept the room with practised efficiency, passing over Colonel Weatherby's newspaper, Mrs. Fortescue's embroidery, the Danes' whispered conversation, and then, quite unexpectedly, they stopped, fixed directly upon Miss Marple herself. He approached with the deliberate steps of someone who had made a decision, his expression shifting from casual interest to something approaching recognition. Mrs. Fortescue, ever alert to fresh conversational material, looked up expectantly from her needlework. "I beg your pardon," the gentleman said, his voice carrying the modulated tones of good breeding, with perhaps the faintest trace of something else, an accent long since polished away by years in drawing-rooms and gentlemen's clubs. "But would you by any chance be Miss Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained one of mild, polite inquiry. In her considerable experience, being recognized by complete strangers was rarely the harbinger of pleasant developments. "I am Miss Marple," she acknowledged gently, setting her knitting carefully in her lap. "Though I'm afraid you have the advantage of me, Mr. Ashford," he supplied quickly. "Charles Ashford. I do apologize for the intrusion, but I was told I might find you here. Your reputation, you see, has preceded you." The words hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Miss Marple was acutely aware that every person in the lounge had abandoned their pretense of disinterest. Colonel Weatherby had not turned a page of his newspaper for a full minute. Mrs. Fortescue's needle had frozen mid-stitch, and even the apologetic Danes had ceased their murmuring. "One's reputation," Miss Marple observed with gentle humour, "is rarely as interesting as people suppose. I fear you may have been misinformed about my significance, Mr. Ashford." Something flickered across his features, relief, perhaps, or disappointment. "Oh, I don't think so," he said, settling uninvited into the chair beside her. "You see, Miss Marple, I believe I may have need of your particular insights. There's been a most disturbing development in my family. My sister-in-law has been receiving threatening letters, and I fear—" He paused, glancing around the room with apparent concern for listening ears. Well, perhaps we might discuss this matter more privately. Miss Marple observed that his hands, though well manicured, bore the telltale stains of someone who had been handling ink recently, and rather carelessly. She also noted that Mrs. Fortescue had gone quite pale, and was now fumbling with her embroidery scissors in a most agitated manner. "Certainly," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, gathering her knitting. "Though I should mention that I am merely an elderly lady on holiday, I fear my reputation for solving mysteries has been rather exaggerated." As she rose from her chair, she caught sight of Mrs. Fortescue's face in the mirror above the mantelpiece. The woman was staring at Mr. Ashford with an expression of unmistakable terror. How very interesting, Miss Marple thought, following her mysterious visitor toward the stairs. In her experience, when someone sought out her reputation for solving problems, the problems were usually far more complex and dangerous than they initially appeared. Mrs. Phelps, the landlady, appeared in the doorway with the particular air of someone who possessed information of potential interest, and was not entirely displeased by the circumstance. She wiped flour-dusted hands on her apron and offered a small curtsy in Miss Marple's direction. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but there's a nice private parlour, just off the side corridor, if you should wish for a bit of quiet conversation. The lounge does get that dreadful draught when folks are coming and going." "How very thoughtful, Mrs. Phelps," Miss Marple replied with genuine warmth. "I believe that would suit admirably." Mr. Ashford, who had been shifting his weight from foot to foot with barely concealed impatience, managed a tight smile. "Anywhere we might speak without interruption would be most appreciated." As the trio disappeared down the narrow corridor, the residence lounge erupted into immediate, vigorous speculation. The departure had been like removing a cork from a bottle of effervescent gossip. "My dear Colonel," Mrs. Fortescue whispered, leaning forward so precipitously that her embroidery silk scattered across the carpet like autumn leaves. "Did you observe his manner? That gentleman knew exactly who she was before he ever crossed the threshold. One doesn't simply stumble upon Miss Jane Marple by accident." Colonel Weatherby harumphed in his characteristic military fashion. "Damn peculiar, if you ask me. Fellow walks in off the street, makes straight for our Miss Marple as if he'd been tracking her movements. Mark my words, Fortescue, there's government business afoot. Secret Service, most likely." "Oh, surely not," Mrs. Fortescue breathed, though her eyes sparkled with the delicious possibility. "This is a respectable establishment. Mrs. Phelps would never permit such goings-on." Across the room, the Reverend Dane adjusted his spectacles and murmured to his wife in tones meant to be discreet, but carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "One mustn't speculate, my dear, but that gentleman had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, a barrister perhaps, or someone from the courts." Mrs. Dane, who had raised 3 sons and was therefore unimpressed by her husband's attempts at charitable restraint, sniffed delicately. "Nonsense, Henry. He had the look of a man with troubles, deep troubles. Did you see how his hands trembled when he spoke to Miss Marple? That's not professional confidence. That's desperation." Young Mr. Hartwell folded his magazine with elaborate casualness and strolled to the mantelpiece, positioning himself with a clear view of the corridor. Rather dramatic entrance, wasn't it? All that business about needing Miss Marple's particular insights. Sounds like something from a sensational novel. In the private parlour, the atmosphere was markedly different. The small room, with its faded chintz and lingering scent of lavender polish, seemed to encourage confidences. Mr. Ashford had chosen the chair facing away from the door, while Miss Marple, with her customary attention to such details, had positioned herself where she might observe both her companion and any movement in the corridor beyond. "I must apologize for the theatrical nature of my approach," Mr. Ashford began, his composure returning somewhat in the privacy. but the situation has become quite urgent, and when my solicitor mentioned you were staying here—" He paused, reaching into his inner coat pocket. "Perhaps it would be best if I simply showed you." The letter he produced was folded and refolded, its edges soft with handling. Miss Marple accepted it with the mild interest of someone examining a recipe, though her eyes sharpened as they moved across the jagged capitals. "You will pay what you owe. The dead do not forget, neither do I." "How very unpleasant," she murmured, refolding the paper with precise movements. "And there have been others?" "3 more, each more specific than the last. They reference events from 20 years ago, a scandal involving my family's hotel in Little Ledbury. My sister-in-law Margaret received them after my brother Robert's death 6 months past." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Miss Marple, the final letter contained details about that night that only someone present in the house could have known." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, though her attention remained fixed on Mr. Ashford's increasingly haggard features. "And you believe someone in your sister-in-law's household is responsible?" "I don't know what to believe anymore. Margaret has been behaving most strangely, dismissing servants, refusing to involve the police. Yesterday, when the latest letter arrived, she became almost hysterical." He ran a hand through his carefully arranged hair. "Miss Marple, I fear that whoever is sending these letters intends more than mere threats." Miss Marple observed that the ink stain she had noticed on his fingers earlier had darkened, as if he had been handling a pen quite recently. She also noted that his story, while compelling, contained certain gaps that a more thorough investigation would need to address. "Mr. Ashford," she said gently, "if your concerns prove justified, this becomes a matter for the proper authorities. However, I shall consider what you've told me. Perhaps you might return tomorrow morning for my answer." After his departure, Miss Marple remained in the quiet parlour, her needles moving in steady counterpoint to her thoughts. In her considerable experience, when someone sought her out so specifically, the problems were invariably more complex and more dangerous than they initially appeared. When Miss Marple emerged from the private parlour, she found the residence lounge transformed into something resembling a drawing room after the announcement of an unexpected inheritance. Conversations ceased mid-syllable, newspapers rustled with unnecessary vigour, and embroidery hoops were clutched like shields against unwelcome revelations. Mrs. Fortescue was the first to break the charged silence, her voice pitched with the careful modulation of someone attempting casual inquiry while harbouring decidedly uncastual concerns. "I do hope, Miss Marple, that your consultation was satisfactory." One couldn't help but notice that Mr. Ashford seemed rather intense in his manner. Miss Marple settled into her chair with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent considerable time in contemplation. As she arranged her knitting, she observed that Mrs. Fortescue's hands were trembling slightly, and that Colonel Weatherby had abandoned all pretense of reading his newspaper, his military bearing now alert with the watchfulness of a sentry who had detected movement in the underbrush. "Mr. Ashford's concerns were quite straightforward," Miss Marple replied with gentle dismissal. "A family matter involving property in Little Ledbury. He mentioned that his family once operated a hotel there, the Ledbury Arms, I believe he called it." The effect of these seemingly innocent words was immediate and profound. Mrs. Fortescue's embroidery hoop clattered to the floor, her face draining of colour so completely that her carefully applied rouge stood out like theatrical paint. Young Mr. Hartwell, who had been lounging against the mantelpiece with studied nonchalance, straightened as if someone had pulled a string attached to his spine. Most telling of all was the Reverend Dane's reaction. The mild-mannered cleric dropped his teacup into its saucer with a sharp clink, his eyes widening behind his spectacles. "The Ledbury Arms, "My dear Miss Marple, surely you don't mean—" "That is to say, there was some rather unpleasant business there some years ago, a tragic incident involving a young woman, if memory serves." "A tragic incident?" Miss Marple's tone carried just the right note of polite interest, though her needles had paused in their rhythmic clicking. She had learned long ago that the most revealing information often emerged when people believed they were being helpful rather than interrogated. Colonel Weatherby cleared his throat with military precision. "Dane's quite right. Scandal sheets were full of it at the time. Guest died under mysterious circumstances. Fire, I believe, though there were whispers of something more sinister. Hotel never recovered from the publicity." Mrs. Fortescue rose abruptly, swaying slightly as if the room had tilted beneath her feet. "I find I have developed a sudden headache," she announced in a voice barely above a whisper. "If you will excuse me, I believe I shall take some air in the garden." She moved toward the French doors leading to the terrace with the unsteady gait of someone walking against a strong wind. In her haste, she left her work-bag beside her chair, its contents partially spilled across the carpet. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of several items of interest: a railway ticket bearing the Little Ledbury station mark dated just 3 days prior, a folded newspaper clipping, and what appeared to be a letter bearing the same jagged handwriting she had observed on Mr. Ashford's threatening correspondence. Young Mr. Hartwell pushed himself away from the mantelpiece with sudden decision. "Perhaps I should ensure Mrs. Fortescue is quite well," he said, though his tone suggested concern of a rather different nature than mere Christian charity. The evening air can be treacherous for those of delicate constitution. After his departure, an uncomfortable silence settled over the remaining occupants. Mrs. Dane fidgeted with her prayer book, while her husband stared into the middle distance with the expression of a man wrestling with unwelcome memories. Miss Marple continued her knitting with apparent serenity, though her mind was working with the precision of a well-oiled mechanism. The ink stain on Mr. Ashford's fingers had been fresh cerulean blue, quite different from the faded black of the threatening letter he had shown her. Mrs. Fortescue's obvious terror upon hearing his name, combined with her recent visit to Little Ledbury, suggested connections that extended far beyond coincidence. And Mr. Hartwell's sudden protective interest in Mrs. Fortescue's welfare indicated that he, too, possessed knowledge he had not shared. In her considerable experience, when 3 people in a small establishment each harboured secrets related to the same tragic event, those secrets rarely remained buried for long. The question was not whether the past would resurface, but rather in what form it would choose to make its appearance. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of raised voices drifted through the French doors from the garden terrace, followed by what sounded distinctly like a woman's cry of distress. The cry from the garden pierced the evening stillness like a blade through silk, causing every occupant of the residence lounge to freeze in their respective poses of feigned disinterest. Colonel Weatherby was the first to react, his military training overriding the tremor that usually plagued his hands, as he rose with surprising agility. "That sounded like genuine distress," he announced, already striding toward the French doors. "Can't have ladies in trouble on my watch." Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her knitting carefully set aside, but her sharp eyes already cataloguing the reactions of those around her. The Reverend Dane had gone quite pale and was fumbling with his spectacles, while Mrs. Dane clutched her prayer book as if it were a shield against unwelcome revelations. The garden of the Rosemary Inn lay bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, its carefully tended borders and climbing roses creating an atmosphere of cultivated tranquility that made the scene before them all the more jarring. Near the ornamental fountain at the far end of the terrace, 2 figures stood in what was unmistakably a confrontation. Mrs. Fortescue pressed herself against the stone rim of the fountain, her face drained of all colour, one hand clutched to her throat in a gesture of either distress or protection. Young Mr. Hartwell stood perhaps 3 paces away, but his posture was aggressive, his usual charming demeanour replaced by something far more menacing. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his voice, though lowered, carried clearly across the still air. 20 years is a long time to run from the truth, Margaret, he was saying, his tone carrying an intimacy that contradicted their supposed recent acquaintance. But you can't hide behind false names forever, not when people start asking the right questions. You don't understand, Mrs. Fortescue whispered, her voice trembling. That night at the hotel, what happened to Sarah? It wasn't supposed to end that way. None of us wanted... Wanted what? Hartwell pressed, taking a step closer. To see her dead, or to see her silenced before she could expose what you'd all been doing? Colonel Weatherby's military bark cut across the garden like a gunshot. I say, what's the meaning of this? Unhand that lady at once, sir. The transformation in Mr. Hartwell was immediate and startling. The menacing interrogator vanished, replaced by the concerned young gentleman who had so solicitously offered to check on Mrs. Fortescue's welfare. He stepped back with a rueful smile, his hands raised in a gesture of innocence. Colonel, Miss Marple, thank goodness you've come. Mrs. Fortescue seemed to suffer a dizzy spell. I was merely trying to assist her to a seat when she became rather confused. The heat, I suspect. Mrs. Fortescue looked between the 2 men, her eyes wide with panic. For a moment, Miss Marple thought she might speak, might reveal whatever terrible secret had driven her to such evident terror. But then the ingrained habits of social propriety reasserted themselves, though they sat uneasily on her frightened features. Yes, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The heat. Mr. Hartwell was most kind. I became quite confused. Miss Marple approached the fountain with careful steps, her experienced eye taking in details that others might overlook in their concern for the apparent victim. The gravel around the fountain showed clear signs of disturbance, scuff marks that spoke of a struggle rather than a genteel fainting spell. More tellingly, Mrs. Fortescue's pearl brooch, which had been securely pinned to her collar at tea time, was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, it would be best if Mrs. Fortescue returned indoors. A cup of hot, sweet tea is often the most effective remedy for confusion brought on by the heat. As Colonel Weatherby gallantly offered his arm to the trembling woman, Miss Marple lingered by the fountain. She watched the small procession retreat toward the house, Mrs. Fortescue leaning heavily on the Colonel's support, Mr. Hartwell following at what seemed a respectful distance, but with his eyes fixed on the older woman's back with unmistakable calculation. Once they had disappeared through the French doors, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to sweep the area more thoroughly. The missing pearl brooch lay half submerged in the fountain's basin, its clasp bent, as if it had been torn away with some force. But it was not the brooch that held her attention for long. Caught on the rough stone of the fountain's rim was a small leather folder, evidently dropped during the altercation. Miss Marple retrieved it with care, noting that it bore the embossed name M. Ashford in faded gold lettering. Inside she found what appeared to be a collection of newspaper clippings, all relating to the same incident. Tragedy at Ledbury Arms, young woman dead in hotel fire. Inquest returns verdict of accidental death. And most intriguingly, hotel staff questioned in connection with guest's death. The photograph accompanying the final clipping showed a group of young people in hotel uniforms, their faces solemn as they posed outside the Ledbury Arms. Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately recognized a younger Mrs. Fortescue among them, though the caption identified her as Miss Margaret Thornfield, hotel receptionist. Standing beside her, his arm draped with casual familiarity across her shoulders, was a young man whose features bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Mr. Hartwell currently residing at the Rosemary Inn. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured to herself, carefully replacing the clippings in their folder. She was about to return to the house when a movement in the shrubbery caught her attention. Someone had been watching the entire confrontation from the concealment of the rhododendrons, and that someone was now retreating with considerable haste, but not before Miss Marple caught a glimpse of a clerical collar and the distinctive flash of spectacles reflecting the dying sunlight. So the Reverend Dane was not quite the timid, unworldly cleric he appeared to be. He too had secrets connected to that long-ago night at the Ledbury Arms. As she made her way back toward the inn, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. The peaceful Rosemary Inn was rapidly revealing itself to be a gathering place for people with very dangerous connections to a 20-year-old tragedy. Mrs. Fortescue was not who she claimed to be. Mr. Hartwell knew far more about her past than any casual acquaintance should, and the Reverend Dane was clearly more involved in these proceedings than his nervous demeanour suggested. Most concerning of all was Mr. Ashford's role in this unfolding drama. His leather folder of clippings suggested he had not sought out Miss Marple by chance, but had come to the Rosemary Inn with a very specific purpose in mind. The question was whether he was seeking justice for an old crime, or planning to commit a new one. As Miss Marple reached the French doors, she could hear animated conversation from within the lounge. The residents were clearly discussing the evening's events with the particular relish that comes from being close to scandal without being directly implicated. But Miss Marple suspected that before this mystery was resolved, everyone at the Rosemary Inn would find themselves far more involved than they could possibly imagine. The past, as she had learned from long experience, never stayed buried for long. And when it finally surfaced, it rarely came alone. The evening descended upon the Rosemary Inn with the particular heaviness that follows moments of social disruption, like the oppressive atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Dinner was served with punctual efficiency, but the dining room atmosphere crackled with unspoken tensions that made every clink of silverware unnaturally loud. Miss Marple took her customary seat by the window, her knitting bag positioned within easy reach, and her gentle demeanour masking the sharp attention with which she catalogued the evening's developments. Mrs. Fortescue had not appeared for dinner, claiming through Mrs. Phelps that a severe headache required absolute quiet and solitude, a convenient excuse, Miss Marple reflected, for avoiding further uncomfortable encounters. The empty chair at Mrs. Fortescue's usual table served as a silent reminder of the afternoon's confrontation, and Miss Marple observed how each remaining guest dealt with this conspicuous absence. Mr. Hartwell seemed almost unnaturally jovial, engaging Colonel Weatherby in animated discussion about cricket scores and local politics. His laughter rang a shade too loud across the quiet room, and his gestures carried the excessive enthusiasm of a man working very hard to appear unconcerned. Yet Miss Marple noted how his eyes repeatedly drifted toward Mrs. Fortescue's empty place, and how his fork paused mid-bite whenever footsteps sounded in the corridor. The Reverend Dane and his wife maintained their characteristic silence, but it had acquired a quality of fearful anticipation that was quite different from their usual gentle reserve. The clergyman's hands trembled so violently that he abandoned his soup spoon entirely, instead reducing his bread roll to a pile of nervous crumbs. Every time the dining-room door opened, whether to admit Mrs. Phelps with the next course or a latecomer from the village, he flinched as if expecting the arrival of some long-dreaded reckoning. Most intriguing of all was Mr. Ashford's behaviour. He sat alone at a corner table, ostensibly absorbed in a leather-bound volume propped beside his plate. But Miss Marple observed that he had not turned a single page during the entire meal. Instead, he was conducting a systematic surveillance of the room, his eyes moving with cold calculation from Hartwell's forced gaiety to the Dane's nervous silence, and occasionally fixing upon Miss Marple herself with an intensity that sent a distinct chill down her spine. It was as the fish course was being cleared that Mrs. Phelps bustled into the dining room with the flushed importance of someone bearing significant news. She approached Colonel Weatherby's table directly, whispering something that caused the old soldier to drop his napkin and half rise from his chair. "Gone," he demanded, his military training making discretion impossible, but she was in no condition to travel anywhere. The dining room fell into complete silence, every conversation halting as if conducted by an invisible maestro. Mrs. Phelps wrung her hands in her apron, clearly relishing her role as bearer of dramatic tidings. "Her room is quite empty, Colonel. All her belongings have been removed, and the window was left standing wide open to the night air. The chambermaid says it looks as though she departed in tremendous haste." Mr. Hartwell was on his feet instantly, his mask of jovial unconcern slipping to reveal something much sharper beneath. "Mrs. Fortescue, but this is impossible. She was clearly unwell just hours ago. Where could she possibly have gone at this time of evening?" "The station master mentioned seeing a lady matching her description boarding the 7:15 to London," Mrs. Phelps supplied with obvious satisfaction. "Said she appeared quite distressed, as if something terrible was pursuing her." Miss Marple continued eating her fish with apparent calm, though her mind was working with the precision of a well-oiled mechanism. Mrs. Fortescue's flight felt both genuine and staged. The panic was real enough, but the circumstances suggested careful orchestration rather than spontaneous escape. "I believe," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the sudden commotion like a blade through silk, "that it would be prudent to notify the local constabulary before anyone disturbs Mrs. Fortescue's room. A guest's sudden disappearance is, after all, a matter that requires proper investigation." The word police had an immediate and revealing effect. The Reverend Dane knocked over his water glass, the liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a dark prophecy. Mr. Ashford snapped his book shut with a sharp report that made Mrs. Dane jump visibly, and Mr. Hartwell froze in the doorway, turning slowly to face Miss Marple with a smile that never reached his calculating eyes. During the subsequent discussion with the village constable who arrived within the hour, Miss Marple observed Mr. Ashford slip quietly from the dining room through the service entrance. She waited a diplomatic moment before murmuring an excuse about retrieving her shawl and following his path. She discovered him in the small telephone alcove beneath the main staircase, speaking in urgent, lowered tones with his back to the corridor. His words carried clearly in the confined space. "Yes, she's gone exactly as we discussed, but the old woman, Marple, she's considerably sharper than we anticipated. She discovered the folder—" "No, I don't believe she's read everything yet, but she suspects—" "Yes, tonight. It absolutely must be tonight." Miss Marple retreated silently into the shadows of the nearby linen cupboard, her heart beating somewhat faster than usual, but her mind crystalline clear. The evening's events were falling into a pattern far more sinister than a simple case of threatening letters. Mr. Ashford, the man who had sought her assistance, was clearly orchestrating something that required Mrs. Fortescue's removal, and viewed Miss Marple herself as a dangerous obstacle. After Mr. Ashford's footsteps faded down the corridor, Miss Marple emerged from her hiding place with grim purpose. She needed to verify one crucial detail before she could be certain of her growing suspicions. Moving with surprising stealth for a woman of her years, she made her way through the garden door into the damp night air. There, in the soft earth, beneath Mrs. Fortescue's open window, illuminated by the spill of light from the dining room, she found exactly what logic had suggested she would discover. The footprints in the flower bed were not the delicate impressions of a lady's hurried departure, but deep, heavy indentations made by a man's boots, boots that had clearly been pacing back and forth in patient waiting. Pressed into the mud beside these telltale marks was a small silver cufflink, engraved with initials that were certainly not Mrs. Fortescue's. Miss Marple retrieved it carefully with her handkerchief, her expression growing increasingly grave. The game was no longer theoretical. The players were moving into their final positions, and unless she was very much mistaken, the night's dangerous work was only beginning. Mrs. Fortescue had not fled. She had been removed, and Miss Marple herself had just been identified as the primary threat to whatever dark purpose was unfolding beneath the Rosemary Inn's deceptively peaceful roof. Miss Marple returned to the warmth of the inn, with the silver cufflink secured carefully in her handkerchief, her mind already weaving the evening's disparate threads into a more coherent pattern. The dining room had emptied considerably since the constable's departure, leaving only Colonel Weatherby in the residence lounge, positioned in his customary chair with a brandy snifter that trembled slightly in his weathered hands. "Dreadful business, this disappearance," he muttered, as Miss Marple settled into her own chair, retrieving her knitting with practised ease. Though I must say the woman seemed the sort to harbour secrets. One develops an instinct for such things after 30 years of military service. People under pressure have a particular way of carrying themselves. Miss Marple's needles began their rhythmic clicking, the familiar sound providing a counterpoint to the tension that seemed to permeate the very walls of the inn. She had observed that people often found the gentle repetition soothing, encouraging them to speak more freely than they might otherwise. "Indeed, Colonel. I wonder if you happened to notice Mr. Ashford's movements this evening? I thought I glimpsed him in the garden earlier, though the light was quite poor by then." The Colonel's military bearing stiffened perceptibly, his eyes taking on the distant focus of someone accessing uncomfortable memories. "Ashford? Now that you mention it, I did see him coming through the side entrance around 6 o'clock. His shoes were muddy, tracked earth across Mrs. Phelps's clean floors. She was quite put out about it, muttering about gentlemen who couldn't be bothered to wipe their feet properly. 6 o'clock would have been precisely when Mrs. Fortescue had claimed her sudden headache and retreated to her room. Miss Marple filed this information alongside the other accumulating evidence, her fingers never pausing in their steady work. The timing was far too convenient to be mere coincidence. "How very careless of him," she murmured, withdrawing the cufflink from her handkerchief and examining it in the lamplight. The initials H.D. were clearly engraved in an elegant script, the silver tarnished with age, but still unmistakably readable. "I found this in the garden, Colonel, rather an expensive piece to lose so carelessly." Before Colonel Weatherby could respond, the sound of raised voices erupted from the floor above, followed by what sounded distinctly like furniture being moved with considerable force. Both occupants of the lounge looked toward the ceiling as footsteps thundered across the upper corridor. Mr. Hartwell's voice carried clearly down the stairwell, stripped of its usual charming modulation and raw with barely controlled anger. "You had no right to move her without consulting me first. This changes everything we agreed upon." The response came in Mr. Ashford's more measured tones, though an undercurrent of steel ran through every syllable. "Your concerns are noted, but the situation required immediate action. The old woman is far more perceptive than we anticipated. She's already found evidence we can't afford to have examined too closely." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused for the briefest moment before resuming their rhythm. Colonel Weatherby had gone quite pale, his military composure cracking to reveal genuine alarm as the implications of the overheard conversation became clear. "Good God," he whispered. "They're discussing you, Miss Marple, and Mrs. Fortescue. It sounds as though they've done something to her." "So it would appear," Miss Marple replied with surprising calm, though her mind was working with crystalline clarity. The conversation above had confirmed her growing suspicions about the nature of Mrs. Fortescue's departure. "I believe we're about to learn something rather important about the true nature of this evening's events." The argument upstairs shifted, voices lowering to urgent whispers that carried less clearly, but conveyed no less intensity. Then came the sound of a door slamming with sufficient force to rattle the chandelier above their heads, followed by rapid footsteps descending the main staircase. The Reverend Dane appeared in the doorway of the lounge, his clerical collar askew, and his face bearing the grey pallor of a man confronting his own mortality. He stopped short upon seeing Miss Marple holding the cufflink, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, recognition, and something that might have been relief. "You found it," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wondered where it had gone. I felt it tear away when she struggled, but in the darkness." He trailed off, seeming to realize what he had just revealed. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the trembling clergyman with gentle but unwavering attention. "Mr. Dane, I believe you have something you wish to tell me about Mrs. Fortescue's departure this evening, and perhaps about events that occurred 20 years ago at a hotel in Little Ledbury." The Reverend sank into the nearest chair as if his legs could no longer support him, his hands shaking so violently that he clasped them together in his lap to still them. "I never meant for any of it to happen, Miss Marple. Not then, and certainly not tonight. But when I saw him preparing to, when I realized what he intended, I couldn't simply stand by and watch." "What who intended, Mr. Dane?" Miss Marple prompted gently, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Ashford," the clergyman whispered, the name seeming to cause him physical pain. "He's been planning this for months, gathering us all here under various pretenses." Mrs. Fortescue never suspected that her identity had been discovered, that her past had finally caught up with her. But tonight, when she realized the truth, he shuddered. "I tried to warn her, to help her escape before he could carry out his plan, but I was too late." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a note of urgency. "Mr. Dane, where is Mrs. Fortescue now? If she's in immediate danger, we must act quickly." The Reverend's eyes filled with tears, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 20 years of guilt and fear. "The old ice house, at the edge of the property. He's keeping her there until he can arrange for her permanent disappearance. Miss Marple, we must help her before it's too late, before he completes what he started all those years ago at the Ledbury Arms." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. Mrs. Fortescue had not fled. She had been taken. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the inn's warm light, a woman's life hung in the balance while her captor prepared to settle a debt that had been 20 years in the making. Miss Marple rose from her chair with decisive purpose, her mild demeanour masking the steel resolve that had seen her through countless dangerous situations. "Colonel, I believe we shall need the constable again, and with considerable urgency. Mr. Dane, you will guide us to this ice house, and pray God we are not already too late." The night had turned bitter cold as the unlikely rescue party made their way through the overgrown grounds behind the Rosemary Inn. Miss Marple moved with surprising agility despite her years, her mind cataloguing every shadow and sound as they followed the Reverend Dane's trembling lantern through the tangled rhododendrons. Colonel Weatherby brought up the rear, his military bearing asserting itself despite the tremor in his hands, a heavy walking stick appropriated from the hall stand serving as both support and potential weapon. The house loomed before them like a burial mound, its stone walls half buried in the hillside and shrouded in 20 years of neglect. Ivy cascaded over its ancient masonry, and the heavy oak door stood ominously ajar, revealing a sliver of flickering light within. The Reverend Dane's confession had painted a grim picture of past sins, but nothing had prepared them for the scene that awaited discovery. "The lock was forced earlier this evening," Dane whispered, pointing to the splintered wood around the iron hasp. "I watched him examining it this afternoon, testing its strength. I should have realized then what he intended." Miss Marple raised her hand for silence, her sharp ears detecting sounds from within the structure. The rhythmic scraping of metal against stone carried clearly in the still air, accompanied by a low humming that sent chills down her spine. Through the gap in the doorway, she could see the interior illuminated by a storm lantern placed on an overturned crate. Mrs. Fortescue sat bound to a wooden chair in the centre of the circular chamber, her mouth gagged with what appeared to be a silk scarf. Her eyes were wide with terror, fixed on a figure working methodically at the far side of the room. Mr. Ashford had discarded his tailored jacket and rolled up his sleeves, wielding a spade with practised efficiency as he excavated what could only be described as a grave. "Nearly finished, Margaret," he said, conversationally, pausing to wipe perspiration from his brow despite the chamber's chill. "Just deep enough to ensure you won't be disturbed, unlike my dear sister Sarah, who they found far too easily after the fire." The revelation hit Miss Marple with crystalline clarity. Sarah Ashford, the young woman who had died in the Ledbury Arms fire 20 years ago. Charles Ashford was not merely investigating threatening letters, he was orchestrating an elaborate revenge against those he held responsible for his sister's death. "You had your chance to tell the truth at the inquest," Ashford continued, his voice carrying the calm reasonableness of madness. "You all did, but you chose to protect yourselves instead. You let them blame faulty wiring, accidental death, anything rather than admit what really happened that night. My sister discovered your smuggling operation, didn't she? She threatened to expose you all, and you decided she was more dangerous alive than dead." Mrs. Fortescue made muffled sounds of protest, struggling against her bonds. Miss Marple observed that the woman's terror seemed genuine, but there was something else in her expression. Guilt, perhaps, or the weight of 20 years of carried secrets. Ashford resumed his digging, the rhythmic scrape echoing off the stone walls. "I've spent 2 decades tracking each of you down. Margaret Thornfield became Mrs. Fortescue, the respectable widow. Henry Dane found God and a clerical collar to hide behind. And young Hartwell—" He paused, his expression darkening. "Well, Hartwell inherited his father's hotel and his father's sins." Miss Marple signalled to her companions, and Colonel Weatherby positioned himself near the entrance, while the Reverend Dane, despite his terror, prepared to create the diversion she had requested. The situation was delicately balanced. One wrong move could precipitate the very tragedy they sought to prevent. "You took Sarah from me with fire and lies," Ashford continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "It seems only fitting that you should understand her final moments, the fear, the certainty that no help would come." He reached for a can of lamp oil that sat beside the lantern, its contents sloshing ominously as he lifted it. The candlelight reflected off the liquid surface, creating dancing patterns on the damp stone walls. "Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple's voice rang out with surprising authority as she stepped into the doorway. "I believe you should reconsider your current course of action." The effect was immediate and electric. Ashford whirled toward her, the lamp oil sloshing dangerously in his grip. His face, illuminated by the flickering light, bore an expression of such anguished fury that even Miss Marple felt a momentary chill. "Miss Jane Marple," he said with bitter recognition, "I should have known you would prove troublesome. Your reputation for interfering in matters of justice precedes you." As the confrontation unfolded, Miss Marple's keen eye caught sight of something that made her pause. There, half hidden in the shadows near the chamber's entrance, lay a small silver object that glinted in the lantern light. Even in the midst of this dangerous situation, her mind filed away the detail for later consideration. The mystery of the threatening letters might be approaching its resolution, but Miss Marple suspected that the full truth of what had happened at the Ledbury Arms and what was happening now at the Rosemary Inn was far more complex than simple revenge. The silver cufflink with the initials H.D. that she had discovered in the garden suggested that not everyone's role in this drama had been revealed. As she prepared to navigate the delicate task of talking down a man driven to madness by 20 years of grief and obsession, Miss Marple reflected that the past had indeed come calling at the Rosemary Inn, but whether justice or vengeance would prevail remained to be seen, and she suspected that before this night was over, more than one carefully guarded secret would be dragged into the unforgiving light. Miss Marple stepped fully into the ice house, her movements deliberate and unthreatening, though her keen eyes catalogued every detail of the chamber's grim tableau. The flickering lantern cast dancing shadows across the stone walls, transforming the circular space into something resembling a medieval torture chamber rather than a simple storage facility. "I understand your grief, Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had witnessed countless human tragedies. "The loss of a beloved sister is a wound that never truly heals. But I wonder if you have considered that your current actions might dishonor her memory rather than vindicate it." Ashford's grip on the lamp oil tightened, his knuckles white against the metal handle. Behind him, Mrs. Fortescue struggled against her bonds, her eyes wide with terror, but also something else, a desperate urgency, as if she were trying to communicate something vital that transcended her immediate peril. "You know nothing of my sister or what they did to her," Ashford replied, his voice thick with 20 years of accumulated rage. "Sarah was brilliant, kind, full of promise. They snuffed out her life as casually as one might extinguish a candle, all to protect their petty criminal enterprise." From the shadows behind Miss Marple, the Reverend Dane stepped forward, his clerical collar askew, and his face bearing the grey pallor of a man finally confronting his own cowardice. "Charles," he said hoarsely, his voice cracking with emotion, "you must listen. It wasn't as simple as you think. We were afraid, yes, but not of exposure alone." Ashford's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You had your chance to explain that at the inquest, Henry. You chose silence. You all did." "Because we were being blackmailed," Dane burst out, the words tumbling from him like water through a broken dam. "Not by Sarah. She was trying to help us. By Edmund Hartwell, the hotel owner, the counterfeiting operation, the stolen printing plates. They weren't ours. We were pawns. Foolish young people terrified of losing our positions. Sarah discovered his ledger, saw what he was forcing us to do. She died because she tried to stand up to him, and we didn't have the courage to support her." Miss Marple felt the delicate balance of the moment shift as this revelation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. The counterfeiting operation explained much: the expensive equipment that would have required the Ledbury Arms as a front, the need for young, impressionable staff who could be easily controlled, and most importantly, the deadly stakes that would have driven Edmund Hartwell to murder. "Convenient," Ashford snarled, raising the oil can higher. "Very convenient indeed, after all these years, to discover that the true villain is safely dead and beyond justice's reach. But his son continues the family tradition, doesn't he?" The accusation hung in the air for a heartbeat before the shadows at the back of the ice house erupted into motion. Mr. Hartwell launched himself from his hiding place among the discarded crates with desperate fury, colliding with Ashford and sending the oil can spinning across the stone floor. The metal container struck the wall with a resounding clang, its contents splashing dangerously close to the lantern. "You won't ruin me," Hartwell shouted as both men crashed to the damp earth, grappling desperately. "I've worked too hard to rebuild everything. I won't let a madman destroy my life over ancient history." Colonel Weatherby surged forward with surprising agility, his military training overriding the tremor that usually plagued his hands. "The lantern," Miss Marple commanded sharply. "Move it away from the oil." As the colonel scrambled to secure the light source, Miss Marple moved swiftly to Mrs. Fortescue's side, her fingers working at the knots with practiced efficiency. The struggle on the floor intensified, Hartwell's youth and desperation giving him advantage over Ashford's grief-fueled rage. During the violent struggle, one of the wooden crates splintered against the stone wall, revealing contents that made Miss Marple's breath catch in her throat. Nestled within the rotting wood were unmistakable printing plates of exceptional quality, bottles of specialty inks and sheets of what appeared to be currency paper, the tools of a sophisticated counterfeiting operation. "The family business," Miss Marple murmured, her voice barely audible over the sounds of combat. As she worked to free Mrs. Fortescue, her sharp eyes caught sight of another crucial piece of evidence, a second silver cufflink lying half-buried in the packed earth near the excavated pit, its surface gleaming in the lantern light. Mrs. Fortescue, her gag finally removed, let out a sob that seemed to carry 20 years of accumulated guilt. "We were so young, so foolish," she whispered through her tears. "Edmund Hartwell promised us money, excitement. We didn't understand how dangerous it would become until Sarah found the plates hidden in the hotel cellar. She was going to the police, going to expose everything." "So you locked her in the storeroom when the fire started," Miss Marple finished softly, her voice heavy with understanding. "And when you had the chance to save her—" "We ran," Mrs. Fortescue sobbed. "God forgive us, we ran and left her to die. It was supposed to be an accident. The fire was an accident. But we could have saved her, and we chose ourselves instead." The fight between Ashford and Hartwell had reached exhaustion, both men panting heavily on the damp stone floor. Colonel Weatherby stood over them with his walking stick raised in warning, while the sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air, growing steadily louder. Miss Marple helped Mrs. Fortescue to unsteady feet, her expression grave, but not without compassion. "The cycle of secrets and violence ends tonight," she said firmly, addressing all present. 20 years ago, fear and greed led to tragedy. Tonight, we choose truth over continued deception. As the blue lights began to flash against the trees outside the ice house, Miss Marple carefully retrieved the second cufflink with her handkerchief, noting its engraved initials matched those of the first. The evidence was complete, physical proof linking the current residents of the Rosemary Inn to both the original crime and tonight's attempted violence. The ghosts of the Ledbury Arms had finally found their voice, and justice, long delayed, was at last approaching through the darkness with measured, inexorable steps. But Miss Marple knew that the full truth of Sarah Ashford's death and the complex web of guilt, fear, and retribution that had brought them all to this moment would require one final, careful unravelling before the morning sun could rise on a world finally free of these particular shadows. The arrival of Inspector Craddock brought the measured authority of proper law enforcement to the chaotic scene within the icehouse. His experienced eye took in the excavated grave, the scattered counterfeiting equipment, and the assembled cast of characters with the weary recognition of someone who had learned to expect complexity whenever Miss Marple's name appeared in his reports. "Miss Marple," he said with resigned respect, "I suspect this evening's events will require considerable explanation. Perhaps you might illuminate how we've arrived at attempted murder, kidnapping, and what appears to be a sophisticated counterfeiting operation." Miss Marple settled herself on a sturdy crate, arranging her shawl against the damp chill, while her sharp eyes catalogued the faces around her. Charles Ashford sat slumped in exhaustion, his earlier fury replaced by hollow confusion. Young Hartwell stood between two constables, his charming facade finally stripped away to reveal something much harder beneath. Mrs. Fortescue trembled beside the Reverend Dane, both bearing the grey pallor of people whose carefully buried secrets had been dragged into unforgiving light. "The truth begins 20 years ago with a young woman named Sarah Ashford," Miss Marple began, her gentle voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber. "She died in a fire at the Ledbury Arms, officially ruled accidental. But Sarah's death was murder, carefully orchestrated by Edmund Hartwell to protect a counterfeiting operation that would have made him wealthy beyond his modest hotel's legitimate earnings." She withdrew the 2 silver cufflinks from her handkerchief, holding them to catch the lantern light. "These belong to Mr. Dane, dropped during his attempts to warn Mrs. Fortescue of the danger she faced. But they also represent something more significant, the physical evidence of how past crimes continue to corrupt the present." Inspector Craddock made careful notes as Miss Marple continued. "Sarah Ashford discovered the counterfeiting plates hidden in the hotel cellars and threatened to expose the operation. Edmund Hartwell responded by arranging what appeared to be an accidental fire, ensuring that Sarah was trapped in a locked storeroom when the flames took hold. The young staff members, Miss Thornfield, now Mrs. Fortescue, and young Henry Dane, were guilty of cowardice in not attempting her rescue, but not of murder itself. The current crisis began when Edmund Hartwell's son inherited more than just debts and a tainted name, Miss Marple observed, turning her penetrating gaze toward Hartwell. He inherited his father's detailed records of that night, including the names of everyone involved and the location of the hidden printing plates. Rather than seeking justice, he saw opportunity. Hartwell's composure cracked completely. "My father destroyed everything. The hotel failed. Our name was ruined. And I spent my entire life trying to escape his shadow. When I found those records, I realized the plates were still here, still valuable. I just needed to eliminate anyone who might expose the connection." "So you orchestrated this elaborate reunion," Miss Marple continued. "You sent threatening letters to Mrs. Fortescue and the others, not because you were receiving them, but to panic them into revealing what they knew. You wanted to flush out any remaining evidence while positioning yourself to claim the plates." Mrs. Fortescue gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "The letters mention details only someone present could have known. But you weren't there that night. You were just a child." "But his father's journal was quite comprehensive," Miss Marple replied sadly. "Edmund Hartwell documented every detail, every participant, every threat he used to ensure their silence. His son used that information to manipulate you all into gathering here, where he could deal with you permanently." Charles Ashford looked up slowly, his expression cycling through rage, comprehension, and finally a profound sadness. "I sought revenge against the wrong people. I would have killed Mrs. Fortescue for cowardice, while the real murderer's son walked free. You became what grief and isolation can make of any of us, Miss Marple said gently. But justice and vengeance are not the same thing, Mr. Ashford. Your sister deserved better than to have her memory tainted by further violence. As Inspector Craddock's men led Hartwell away in handcuffs, the young man's protests echoing off the ancient stones, Miss Marple rose with a soft sigh. The counterfeiting plates would be evidence now, the threatening letters revealed as manipulation rather than genuine menace, and the truth of Sarah Ashford's death would finally see proper legal proceedings. The Reverend Dane approached her hesitantly, his clerical collar askew, and his face streaked with tears. Miss Marple, can you ever forgive us? We were young, frightened, but that's no excuse for letting an innocent woman die. Forgiveness is not mine to grant, Mr. Dane, Miss Marple replied with characteristic gentleness. But understanding, that is something we can all strive for. 20 years of guilt have been punishment enough. Perhaps now you can find a way to honor Sarah's memory through truth rather than continued silence. As dawn began to filter through the trees outside the ice house, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations. The past had indeed come calling at the Rosemary Inn, bringing with it all the accumulated weight of choices made in fear and desperation. But sometimes, she mused, the most important thing was not the punishment of the guilty, but the liberation of those who had carried undeserved burdens for far too long. The mystery of the threatening letters was solved, the counterfeiting operation exposed, and Sarah Ashford's murder would finally receive the justice it deserved. Yet Miss Marple found herself thinking not of triumph, but of the terrible human cost of secrets kept too long in darkness. The pale November dawn cast long shadows across the Rosemary Inn's breakfast room, where the surviving participants in the night's drama gathered with the peculiar awkwardness of people who had shared profound trauma, yet remained virtual strangers. Miss Marple sat at her customary table by the window, her knitting needles clicking with familiar rhythm, though her sharp eyes catalogued every nuance of the subdued conversations occurring around her. Inspector Craddock had returned to complete what he termed, with professional understatement, the formalities. At Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, he conducted his final interviews in the residence lounge, where, as she observed, people are often more truthful when they feel themselves on familiar territory. The counterfeiting operation and attempted murder are clear enough, Craddock began, settling near the hearth with his notebook. What requires clarification is how you piece together the connection between past and present crimes, Miss Marple. Miss Marple looked up mildly from her knitting. The key was recognizing that two separate plots were operating simultaneously, Inspector. Mr. Ashford sought confrontation and confession at worst, violent revenge. Mr. Hartwell, however, intended murder from the outset. The threatening letters were his creation, not Mr. Ashford's. Mrs. Fortescue shuddered, her composure finally cracking. Those letters described Sarah's final moments in terrible detail. How could he know such things if he wasn't there? From his father's meticulously kept journal, Miss Marple replied gently. Edmund Hartwell documented every aspect of his criminal enterprise, including the names of everyone involved and the methods he used to ensure their silence. His son used that information to manipulate you all into gathering here, where he could eliminate the remaining witnesses permanently. The Reverend Dane approached hesitantly, withdrawing a small leather journal from his pocket. His hands trembled as he placed it on the table before Miss Marple. This belonged to Sarah Ashford. I found it hidden in the hotel garden after the fire, where she must have concealed it before confronting Edmund Hartwell. It contains detailed records of the counterfeiting operation, including dates, amounts, and the names of prominent businessmen purchasing the false currency. Miss Marple accepted the journal with careful reverence, recognizing immediately its significance as the final piece of a 20-year-old puzzle. This would have been devastating evidence at the inquest. "Why did you keep it hidden, Mr. Dane?" "Because I was a coward," Dane replied simply, his voice thick with self-recrimination. Edmund Hartwell had threatened to frame us all as willing participants. He possessed carefully arranged evidence suggesting we were partners rather than victims. I told myself I was protecting Margaret and the others, but truly, I was protecting myself. Charles Ashford appeared in the doorway, flanked by a constable but walking with dignity intact. The consuming rage that had driven him for 2 decades had burned itself out, leaving behind a man who looked older, but somehow more human. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology. You prevented me from becoming the very thing I despised. When I learned the truth that Hartwell, not these frightened people, orchestrated my sister's death, you helped me choose justice over vengeance." Miss Marple regarded him with characteristic gentleness. "Grief can distort even the clearest vision, Mr. Ashford. Your love for Sarah became twisted by silence and injustice until it resembled hatred. But last night you chose to listen rather than destroy." She opened Sarah's journal carefully, scanning the young woman's neat handwriting with growing comprehension. The final entry, dated the day of her death, revealed naive optimism about truth prevailing over corruption. "Sarah believed in the power of justice," Miss Marple observed softly. "She thought exposing the counterfeiting operation would be sufficient protection. She didn't understand how desperate men become when their livelihoods are threatened." As Inspector Craddock departed with his prisoners and evidence, the Rosemary Inn began its gradual return to tranquility. Mrs. Fortescue, now openly Margaret Thornfield again, sat opposite Miss Marple, her face bearing the lightness that comes from no longer carrying crushing guilt. 20 years of looking over my shoulder," she murmured. "And in the end, it wasn't the police I should have feared, but the son of the man who started it all." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the gentle clicking providing counterpoint to her thoughts. "Fear is often a more restrictive prison than any cell, my dear, but you've chosen courage at last." Later, alone in the quiet lounge, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of human weakness and strength that had been revealed. The mystery was solved, justice would be served, and Sarah Ashford's memory finally vindicated. But more importantly, the living had been given opportunity to emerge from the shadows of past mistakes and begin the difficult work of genuine redemption. Human nature, she mused, was rather like the tangled skeins in her work-bag, knotted by fear and vanity and love, yet capable, with patience, of being drawn out into something orderly and even beautiful. One simply had to see clearly where the threads had crossed and possess the wisdom to untangle them gently. The past, as she had learned from long experience, never truly disappeared. But sometimes, with careful handling, it could be transformed from a source of darkness into a foundation for something better. The morning sun cast gentle patterns across the Rosemary Inn's breakfast room as Miss Marple completed the final rows of her knitting, the soft blue wool flowing through her fingers with practiced ease. 3 days had passed since the dramatic events at the ice house, and the establishment had gradually resumed its customary tranquillity, though an air of subdued reflection lingered in the corridors like incense after a memorial service. Mrs. Phelps bustled about her duties with renewed vigour, her earlier distress replaced by the particular satisfaction that comes from having survived extraordinary circumstances with one's reputation intact. The residence lounge had been restored to its former genteel atmosphere, though Miss Marple observed that conversations now carried a deeper undercurrent of genuine human connection, rather than mere social pleasantry. Inspector Craddock arrived for what he termed his final consultation, settling into the familiar chair opposite Miss Marple with the comfortable ease of someone who had learned to value her insights above official protocols. "The case is proceeding smoothly," he reported, accepting the tea she poured with characteristic grace. "Young Hartwell faces charges for kidnapping and attempted murder, while the counterfeiting evidence has reopened the investigation into the original Ledbury Arms incident. Sarah Ashford's journal has proven invaluable in establishing the full scope of Edmund Hartwell's criminal enterprise." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. "Justice delayed is not always justice denied, Inspector. Sometimes truth requires decades to emerge from the shadows where fear and guilt have hidden it." Charles Ashford appeared in the doorway, dressed for travel and carrying a small suitcase alongside Sarah's recovered journal. The consuming rage that had driven him for 20 years had transformed into something approaching peace, his features bearing the lightness of a man finally unburdened. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said quietly, approaching their table. "You prevented me from becoming the very monster I thought I was hunting. When I realized that Hartwell, not these frightened people, had orchestrated my sister's death, you helped me choose justice over vengeance." "Grief can be a terrible prison, Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple replied gently. "But you found the key to your own cell when you chose to listen rather than destroy. Your sister's memory is better served by truth than by further violence." Margaret Thornfield entered the lounge with the Reverend Dane, both bearing the subdued dignity of people who had finally stopped running from their past. The weight of 20 years of carried guilt had lifted from their shoulders, replaced by the difficult but liberating work of genuine repentance. "We're returning to Little Ledbury," Margaret announced, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes, "to establish a memorial fund in Sarah's name. It won't bring her back, but perhaps it will help other young people who find themselves in dangerous situations." Colonel Weatherby, who had remained throughout the aftermath, leaned forward with obvious curiosity. "I still don't quite understand how you saw through it all so quickly, Miss Marple. The rest of us were completely taken in." Miss Marple smiled, setting down her knitting to give the question proper attention. "It was really quite straightforward, Colonel. Mr. Ashford's ink-stained fingers bore fresh cerulean blue from a gentleman's fountain pen, yet the threatening letters were written in heavy commercial black. Mr. Hartwell carried just such a marker, ostensibly for his racing forms. More tellingly, his reaction to Mrs. Fortescue's disappearance was anger rather than concern. He spoke of broken agreements rather than safety. She retrieved the silver cufflinks from her handbag, holding them to catch the morning light. And then there were these, dropped by Mr. Dane during his attempt to warn Mrs. Fortescue. His terror was genuine, but it wasn't the fear of exposure, it was the fear of watching history repeat itself. As Miss Marple prepared for her departure, gathering her belongings with methodical care, she reflected on the week's extraordinary events. The mystery of the threatening letters had been solved, the counterfeiting operation exposed, and Sarah Ashford's murder would finally receive the justice it deserved. Yet, as the taxi arrived to carry her back to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple found herself thinking not of triumph, but of redemption. The ghosts of the Ledbury Arms had been laid to rest, and the living had been given the precious gift of truth and, ultimately, peace. "Human nature is endlessly complex," she murmured to herself, as the familiar countryside rolled past the window, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. "But it is also capable of surprising grace. One simply must know where to look, and have the patience to untangle even the most complicated threads." The mystery was solved, justice served, and the Rosemary Inn restored to its deceptive tranquility. It had been, Miss Marple reflected with quiet satisfaction, a most educational holiday indeed.